Good afternoon and welcome everyone to our learning community series addressing veteran and military substance use, promoting recovery through collaboration and compassion. This is our session number 1, understanding substance use trends among veterans. Welcome in. Next slide, please. Well, if you've been a part of these learning communities before, I'm sure you're seeing a different face than you're used to. My name's Phil Patty. I will be the session moderator for our great group of presenters today. I'm a project associate with SAMHSA Service Members, Veterans, and their Families Technical Assistance Center here at Policy Research Associates. Next slide. All right, disclaimer off the top. The views, opinions, and content expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. As a SAMHSA-funded entity, the SMVF TA Center complies with the current executive orders and aligns with SAMHSA's strategic priorities. The current priorities do not support harm reduction as outlined in SAMHSA's Dear Colleague letter on harm reduction. Next slide, please. Okay, welcome again to everyone joining us today. If this is your first learning community session, welcome aboard. And if you've been here before, welcome back. We'll be getting to some introductions just for all of you to introduce yourselves through the chat and say hello. We'll give a brief overview of what to expect for today. Then we'll jump right into our presentation. We have 2 great presenters you'll be hearing from today, Dr. Gorman and Dr. Reilly. We'll have a couple of opportunities for a facilitated discussion. We have a couple preloaded questions to kind of get the brains moving here. That'll be your opportunity to either enter in your questions through the chat or to answers through the chat, or to raise your hand and take yourself off mute to ask to the broader audience. Then we'll have a brief moment to wrap up and talk about next steps for the next learning community session. Thank you. Next slide. All right, just a few housekeeping items off the top here. Please do set your name to how you'd like to be called upon during this virtual meeting. I know sometimes we enter the meetings and it may already have something preset for you. So just make sure that that name that's on your screen there is what you'd like to be referred to. Also, go ahead and disable any AI transcription or recording services, and you can use Zoom's live transcription setting instead. This is being recorded, so you'll get a copy of this in the slides as well as any resources that are shared during the meeting. As we do get to that discussion period, as I mentioned, there'll be 2 kind of separate times splitting up the presentation to have that discussion. If you are able, turn on that video. That just gives us a little bit greater sense of community on this virtual space. Along with that, we know you may be in a certain environment that may be a little bit loud, so mute that microphone unless you are speaking to the group. And along with that, you can use the raise hand function during those discussion periods if you'd like to come off mute, or that chat box function to communicate with the group. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, just going to outline our 3 learning community session objectives here. Examining the current trends in substance use, specifically among our veterans. Exploring how trauma exposure, chronic pain, and reintegration challenges contribute to substance use within the veteran population, and discuss co-occurring mental and behavioral health conditions commonly seen among veterans with substance use disorder. Next slide, please. All right, this is where you all come into play. Please do take a minute to introduce yourselves in that chat. If you wouldn't mind, you can put your name, agency or organization, as well as your state, territory, or tribal affiliation. Thank you. And as we're doing that, next slide, welcome aboard. Thank you all. I see them pouring in. And as we usually do with our learning communities, we have just a quick poll question here. Did you attend the March 3rd webinar on addressing veteran substance use, promoting recovery through collaboration and compassion? And I know there's a recording there as well. All right, another 5 seconds or so to answer that one. And if you haven't, it's a good reminder that you can watch that recording. All right. Thank you. All right, next slide. Okay, our two presenters that we have for you today, you'll be hearing from Dr. J.A. Gorman, clinical research psychologist and director of social reintegration research program, director of education for Vision 1, Mental Illness Research Education and Clinical Center, MyRec, as many of you may know it as, at VA Bedford Healthcare System. Along with Dr. Gorman, we have Dr. Aaron D. Reilly, clinical research psychologist, co-director for Vision 1 MyRec, VA Bedford Healthcare System, and assistant professor of psychiatry at UMass Chan Medical School. Welcome, Dr. Gorman. Dr. Reilly, next slide. And I will turn it over to you.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for attending today to talk a little bit about substance use trends among veterans. So why don't we move to the next slide, and I will tell you a little bit. So first of all, as Philip mentioned before, same with us. The views expressed here in this presentation are those of us, the presenters, and don't necessarily reflect the position, policy, or views of the Department of Veteran Affairs or the United States government. So move on through that one together. Appreciate you bearing with me. All right, so I know about a third of people from the last poll attended the last presentation. So for you, this one slide might be a review, but we're going to tweak it a bit. And for those who are new, we just want to frame this a little bit within as we talk, within something called the biopsychosocial model. And then we'll sort of move forward. And so, as we sort of discuss about substance use disorders among the veteran population, let's examine it from this kind of perspective. So just so we know, like we're going to touch on all these topics today. The bio part refers to our physical health, genetics, something biological, combat injuries, nervous system changes, traumatic brain injuries, impact of service related injuries in general. Family biology matters, right? We know a substantial share of people with alcohol dependence, around 30%, have a parent with the same challenge. So this really part of this is similar to, this is the biological part that we're going to be mentioning when we sort of couch these trends that we talk about. Now, the psycho part of this model, psychological factors, refers to our thoughts, our emotions, trauma memories, post-traumatic stress, depression, anxiety, the ways we cope with stress. Do we take things one at a time, or do we catastrophize, right? Do we assume the worst possible outcome will occur? How reactive are we? And then the last part we'll talk a little bit about is the social part of the biopsychosocial model. These social factors matter, right? The culture we are in, the support systems that we have, the environment, right? Our relationships, our housing, our work, our finances, and how connected we are or how isolated we feel in the communities that we live. So all three parts interact with each other. And when several are stressed at the same time, the risk of substance use goes up. And, we know many veterans live with multiple health conditions at once, right? Veterans on average that are seen in primary care are diagnosed with about 2.7 different mental health diagnoses and about 4.5 total medical and mental health diagnoses together, like all together there. And sometimes we call this stacking, right, of medical and mental health conditions that can increase vulnerability to substance use. And, we put those in with chronic pain and insomnia and unemployment and post-traumatic stress. So, these together add up. So substance use is often a response to this pain, right? Whether it's physical, emotional, social, some of these challenges, and not a sign of weakness or a character flaw or any of that. And so when we look at it in this full picture, right, this biopsychosocial model, we're able to approach veterans with compassion. We don't blame, and to focus on treatment and support and not judgment. So that's the frame that we're sort of moving towards today, is this biopsychosocial model. And so I will kick it over and we'll go to the next slide.
So before we talk about substance use trends, especially in the veteran population, I think it's really important to really consider the historical trends of what we've thought of as substance use. I mean, substance use and substance misuse have been around for as long as probably humans have been around. And it's only until very recently we've started to actually shift, not completely, toward a more medical model from a more moral model of what it means to use and misuse substances. The original DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Mental Health Issues, in 1952 didn't even really have a category for this. It was under the sociopathic personality disturbance, which I think speaks a lot to the historical framework we're still kind of working under. And we didn't even have formal subcategories until the third version of the DSM in 1980. Generally, as a category of mental illness and health issues, we now think of substance use disorder as a chronic relapsing mental health condition characterized by compulsive, recurring seeking of illicit substances and alcohol, despite functional problems related to that use, which can be severe, harmful, and often very debilitating to someone's quality of life. This also includes, of course, lots of different thoughts around what is and isn't an illicit substance or substance misuse, and that would go beyond the capacity of this conversation to fully explore. But more and more, we've been looking at not just what we consider illicit drugs, but also the misuse of things like prescribed drugs or things that even more broadly would not even be classified as drugs and actually are often classified as things like nutritional supplements. So things like kratom misuse or use of what is considered to be gas station substances. Which have been really rising, not just among our veteran population, but also just the general civilian United States population and beyond too. So there's the piece around what are and are not substances as we're trying to think about how to address this and look at trends. There's also the piece around people who do not meet full criteria for a substance use disorder. So we have many people, for instance, who would test positive on something like the audit C for alcohol misuse. And that is, going to indicate, potential alcohol use disorder, but some people will still not meet formal criteria. But that positive audit C can be very reflective of hazardous drinking that has many severe implications for social, occupational life, physical health. So this is all, related to the shift away from using things like abuse, lots of other terms I'm not going to use right now, and even dependence, and thinking about there's a single continuum of things that we would consider substance use disorder and substance misuse, and really kind of categorizing it more around the impact it has on the individual when we think about treatment. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk about those trends because it is very important and these are constantly shifting. And I just also want to point out very related to sometimes geography. So you'll see a lot of shifts in terms of more specific rates of use depending on the geography of where someone is living. And for instance, what drugs are available, what the illicit drug scene might look like. But these are rougher estimates. So about 10% of veterans have an alcohol use disorder. So that would be meeting full criteria in the DSM-5 TR for alcohol use disorder from mild to severe. However, moving back to thinking about this in a more continuous basis, we are definitely seeing what we would consider binge or hazardous drinking in about anywhere from a quarter to sometimes more of our veteran population. And this has been generally pretty steady. We're also, when we're thinking about these trends, I want to point out that alcohol and then tobacco use, we're often getting our quote unquote best estimates from those two as they are not considered illicit substances and people are actually being screened for them in the VA pretty regularly during primary care visits. So tobacco use is actually a little lower than it used to be. So we're very happy about that. So roughly about 21% of veterans still report using tobacco products, which is higher than the civilian population, but actually lower than it used to be. Now, use of e-cigarettes or vapes, very difficult to know how much, nicotine dependence is being, occurring in those populations, because we don't have great estimates of that, and our tobacco use screeners don't always catch that. But generally, we're still seeing a pretty high rate of tobacco use in our veterans, and this is a problem, of course, not just for, obviously cancer-related downstream impacts, but also, the financial burden, the social burden. We have a lot of issues related with tobacco use. It's certainly not less impactful than other substances. Cannabis use has increased since around 2019, pretty much across the board in different surveys. It's about a 3.6 rate, though, of cannabis use disorder. And so we're seeing a lot of cannabis use. We're not seeing people necessarily reporting at the level that we would see cannabis use disorder being assigned to them as a diagnostic issue. There can be lots of different reasons for this. And some people, they are using cannabis for medical reasons, and they have, the ability to do so, and it is potentially legal and appropriate to their care. And other people are using cannabis at a certain rate, and it looks very different for them. So we're hoping to get better estimates on this as we start piecing that apart in the research in the next couple of years. Opioids are a really good area of seeing like a impact of our attempts to stop overprescribing or misprescribing. So we've definitely seen a decrease since 2017 in opioid use disorder, but still currently about 1%. And considering how terribly negatively impactful opioid use disorder can be on individuals, especially when we think about its pretty common co-occurrence with chronic pain, which also has terrible downstream impacts on functioning and quality of life. This is still way too many people. And we are also seeing, again, when you think about the full range, about 550,000 veterans on average reporting pain medication misuse. So they might not be meeting OUD criteria, but they're misusing their pain medication, and they're self-reporting that. Stimulants is a really interesting area that I would love to discuss more with this group around really rising rates being seen. Currently around anywhere from 0.6 to 2% in the veteran population, depending on regionally, especially where you're kind of looking at that use. But stimulant use disorder is not being necessarily given to people. And basically, like everything except for alcohol and tobacco, there's highly stigmatizing and legal reasons why people are afraid to disclose this. So we have to assume these are all extremely conservative estimates. And sometimes it gets lost in the mix, but polysubstance use is huge and on the rise, and particularly problematic when we think about treatment. The DSM, for instance, has no suggestions on what to do when someone has polysubstance use or co-occurring mental health and substance use disorder issues. So this is more common probably than what we're seeing in the 7% with alcohol and another illicit substance. For instance, with the OUD, we're seeing, much higher rates of co-occurring substance use. But this is particularly problematic in terms of worrying trends and something we need to take into account more. Next slide. And just really quickly want to point out, so I think this is probably a lot of people on this call already know this, but we have approximately 14% of veterans reporting at least one substance use disorder in the past year. 96 of those 14% believe they don't need treatment. And that's not telling the full story, of course, with substance use disorder treatment, because about 10% of veterans are getting substance use disorder treatment who have a SUD in their a current substance use disorder diagnosis. So there's a gap there. We're seeing people who are engaging in treatment, first of all, who may not believe that they truly need formal treatment for substance use disorder. And we're also seeing a ton of veterans who are not getting any treatment for their substance use disorder. And there can be lots of reasons why. It's not necessarily that they feel like their substance use is not a problem in their lives or something that needs to be treated, but there can be a lot of perverse incentives for not seeking treatment. So actually helping these veterans to realize that seeking treatment should be a priority in their lives if they want to improve their functioning and quality of life is often like the first step in getting them the care they need. Next slide.
All right. So, when we look at sort of the unique challenges for veterans, we want to sort of give an overview, right? We'll talk first about the transition, right? For many veterans, the transition from military life to civilian life is not a simple change in job status, right? It can involve the loss of identity, community, your routine, your income, your housing stability, long-term career plans. So research really shows that reintegration stress is associated with higher suicide risk, right? Even beyond the other important risk factors. So this transition is associated with just higher risk in general. And in other words, right, the stress of leaving the military can create emotional strain that affects many parts of veterans and their families' lives. So, and when we look at this, right, entering the military is a highly structured process, right? As we all know, it's clear steps, strong supervision, defined timelines. And in contrast, leaving is less structured, right? And places more responsibility on the individual to sort of figure out what services, benefits, and supports they need, right? Veterans across this timeline of leaving, right, when they're out, veterans may be asked to navigate thousands of different government and nonprofit resources that may match them, and it can be confusing and very overwhelming. So in this process, it can feel like a loss of culture, of identity, and military culture shapes how people see themselves, how they relate to others, how we solve problems, and civilian culture operates very differently. So the transition can feel like moving between different worlds, different expectations, values, social norms, right? It's not just a workplace culture. It shapes your identity, your trust, your sense of belonging in the military. And just anecdotally, right, I hear veterans say, like, in the military, people had my back, right? We were trained to look out for each other. And in the civilian life, it can feel like no one really has your back, or very few. And this captures a lot when, the loss really, the loss. I mean, people were willing to sort of die for each other, right? In this built-in community and support. And, there's a deep loss often during this reintegration process. So this cultural shift really makes it hard for veterans, often for individuals to feel understood, not all, and grounded during the transition. So I'll just talk about the culture itself, right? It's embedded sometimes in a system, and if we sort of shift how substance use comes in. So, I mean, from World War I through really the Vietnam era, let's talk about the system. Cigarettes were routinely included in U.S. military rations, right? Smoking became tightly woven into the everyday culture of service members, right? Even as evidence about sort of harms of smoking emerged in the 50s, the military continued to distribute cigarettes and rations until about 1975. And tobacco companies kind of actively sent free cigarettes to troops. And, it makes tobacco use often feel normal, right? When everyone has it. So it turns into the smoking turns into a common way to cope with stress, to pass time, to bond with peers, right? It becomes part of the culture. And by 1985, the Department of Defense had some studies that sort of showed, that the culture ran deep, right? 47% of active duty personnel smoked compared to about 30% at that time. In the civilians. So, and eventually, right, we know smoking showed it hurt troop readiness, increased medical costs, and now veterans, just tobacco use, it's 1 in 5, 1 in 4, and civilians, it's around 1 in 7. But we, that was within a system of use, right, and a culture within that system that can affect kind of future generations, right, even after it officially stopped. And so, individuals are within that culture and within that system, and it has implications, right, to be within that embedded. Now, let's just also talk about pre-existing risk factors. We sometimes call them adverse childhood experiences, right? So when we talk about those, we're looking at some studies using large U.S. samples that show men with military service report more of these adverse childhood experiences than men who never served. So growing up in homes with alcohol or drug problems, things of that nature. And this means, service members arrive in the military, right? Some already predisposed to and at risk for things like substance use because of what they lived through as children, right? Before they ever put in a uniform. So in the modern all volunteer era, right, men who served in the military had higher rates of all 11 types of adverse childhood experiences that were measured compared to men who didn't serve. So one striking example was sexual violence, right? Men with military service were about twice as likely to report being forced to have sex before age 18 as men without military service. And in earlier draft eras, differences were smaller, but the overall pattern suggests that many people, some who choose military service, are more likely to carry heavy childhood burdens into their adult lives, right? So which can impact reactions to stress, right? And sort of this predisposition, this risk. Now, eras of service matters as well, because different generations of veterans were exposed to different wars, right? Policies, drug environments, which shaped risk for alcohol and drug problems in very different ways. Now, like for veterans from different eras, right? Vietnam, Gulf War, post 9/11, and everything in between. So and after, right? You didn't fight in the same war. We didn't have the same rules. You didn't have the same access to drugs. So their substance use patterns are not going to be the same either, right? So the Vietnam era combined with the draft and sort of easy access to drugs in theaters and limited awareness of long-term consequences, right, contributed to higher rates of alcohol and drug use disorders, particularly around opioids and sedatives among those veterans compared to non-veterans. And later in the Gulf War and wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, right, service members were still at higher risk for alcohol use disorder than some of their non-deployed peers. And the picture becomes more complex, right? In post 9/11, there's intense and repeated combat deployments, there's chronic pain, there's at a time when there was heavy opioid prescribing, as Dr. Reilly mentioned. So many veterans are struggling with multiple overlapping conditions like post-traumatic stress and pain and sort of other substance use rather than a single isolated problem. We can move to the next slide. Oh,
Okay. Thank you. So now for the audience, a couple of questions here to pose to you all, kind of related to your own communities. Question one here: based on the trends presented, what substance use patterns are you seeing within your own community? How do they compare with what was shared on the previous slides? And along with that, are there, what are those biggest gaps or challenges between what veterans need and what's currently available in your system? And folks can use that raise hand function. You can enter your question into, or use the Q&A. Maybe these trends are similar to what you're seeing in your own community. If you have a question outside of this too, I see Victor. Victor has his hand raised. Go ahead, Victor.
Yeah, good morning to everybody. I see a lot of meth in my community where I work for Los Angeles County. I see a lot of opioid use, fentanyl, and methamphetamine. And it's just rampant. So we're dealing with that is kind of challenging. And especially trying to get somebody help this, especially with the opioid. Well, the meth is bad too, but the opioid is definitely, the fentanyl is definitely a problem because of the withdrawal symptoms. And as far as veterans, it's veterans and just all people mix in that category.
Dr. Gorman, Dr. Reilly, anything? Yeah, go ahead.
No, we're seeing similar trends in the New England area as well, and especially more around stimulant use. Though we're still seeing very high rates of methamphetamine use, obviously, but the alcohol use is gone out of control a little bit. And I do wonder. I would love to do research on this, but especially in lots of different areas nationally, there was a real push to make it so that you could have delivery alcohol, which prior to COVID was illegal in Massachusetts at the very least, in a lot of places. And I think that with COVID, we made it even easier for people to get different types of substances delivered right to their home. There has been very little research on the impact of that with these rising rates. So thank you, Victor.
Thank you. Just taking a look at the chat here. Thank you for everyone for your contributions here. I see Virginia mentioned very comparative alcohol trends, also significant marijuana THC use. That lines up with what we saw on that previous slide, where we're seeing that increase in cannabis use and and a decrease in opioid use since 2017 as well. I see Rachel, alcohol seems to be a big one as it's socially acceptable and very few feel like it's something they need help with. Yeah. And that lines up with that other piece that Dr. Reilly mentioned about that 96% believing they do not need treatment. And I see Cheryl, more polysubstance use. Yep. And folks agreeing with that. Virginia, big gap in psychoeducation and professional guidance on using THC marijuana in a medical way, self-medicating. And I'll pause there for our presenters. Anything to mention in terms of that?
I'll just say, I certainly haven't received like a lot of guidance on what, on sort of how best to navigate that, right? That gap on prescription versus recreation versus use. And so I think that's a gap in the literature right now. So, hoping for more in the future.
Thank you, Dr.
Yeah. Use and possession of marijuana at all VA medical centers is prohibited, right? Some people may be getting it from external prescriptions, but there's no recommended or prescribing doctrine, at least in VA, around prescribing medical marijuana. But we know people are using it. They're disclosing it to us. It becomes, a lot of these things become a problem, that in hindsight, it was a replacement of one thing with another, and now you just have two things, or an attempt to replace one substance with another, and now you have two things. So I think that's something to keep in mind too, is really not just assuming it's a problem, but also like really investigating with the individual, what was the function of this? Is it meeting that function? Like really sort of like conceptualizing what they were trying to get with that substance in terms of like getting them into the right treatment program. Because it's very difficult to know sometimes what the inclination was or the motivation was to use any substance. So you have to be really curious around that.
Well put. Few final comments, and then we'll move on to the second half of the presentation here. I see Nancy said, similar to what I'm seeing in my community, alcohol is huge. As always, I was surprised to see that opioid usage is down overall. Q2, Cheryl, time to get into treatment in New Hampshire is a challenge. We have a CCN system here, but VA likes to admit to VA facilities when possible, so it can be weeks before that occurs. And clients often lose motivation before admitting and waiting for a few days. Those, wait times, that gaps in care can always be, one of those major issues we see across our teams. Adam, one of the biggest gaps is around stigma. Yeah, absolutely, Adam. other mental barriers to care. Yeah, that stigma piece is always you know, a big barrier for us to get through, and creating some effective strategies to get around that. And I see Deb there. Also about New Hampshire, we got some New Hampshire folks on the call. When it comes to peer recovery support for veterans, alcohol is still #1, and locating peer support specific for veterans is missing. That's a gap there. VA systems don't refer community folks to community-based peer support programs like recovery community centers. And then Misty, again, with the methamphetamine being leading the trend in Mississippi. So thank you all for your questions and comments and participation. If there's anything else to say here, we will move on to the next slide, and I'll turn it back over to Dr. Gorman and Dr. Reilly.
Right. Well, you know, I'll say veterans face, you know, as we sort of, as you're all pointing out in the chat, right? You know, location and region matters, and people have different challenges, and often veterans face overlapping challenges, right? And it's not just one problem at a time, right? You know, among Iraq and Afghanistan veterans diagnosed with substance use disorder, about 82 to 93% had also at least one mental health diagnosis, most commonly post-traumatic stress and depression or anxiety. You know, but this overlap matters, right? Because combat trauma, blast exposure, military sexual trauma can increase the risk of both mental health substance use problems, and both mental health and substance use problems. So, in other words, right, substance use in veterans is often tied to all these things: trauma, stress, attempts to cope, not just the substance itself, right? So, pain is another major part of the picture. The veterans are more likely than non-veterans to develop chronic pain earlier in life. So, in part, it's because of repetitive training, right? Physically demanding work, right? Injuries, cumulative wear and tear on the body that happens while you're in service. So, and you know, the other thing is the culture, as we discussed earlier, it can play a role, right? Many service members maybe are taught to push through the pain or to avoid reporting injuries. Um, and there's a culture of toughness that can sort of delay treatment and sometimes allow injuries to worsen. And this can sort of increase the risk of long-term pain. Now, mental health, pain, substance use, they also interact with prescribing patterns. You know, I know now sort of some of these prescribing patterns are since started to become diminished. So we have some literature that says that. But you know, veterans with mental health diagnoses, especially post-traumatic stress, when we looked at patterns years ago, they're more likely to receive opioid medications, often at higher doses or alongside other sedating medications, which can raise the risk for opioid use disorder and other poor outcomes. And so, you know, this is the type of sort of research that have helped look at prescribing patterns and you know, look and sort of help to make changes within the system. But it's something to sort of look towards. We'll go to the next slide. So, as you know, as it was mentioned, before we kind of get into this, one important challenge is that many people aren't ready to enter treatment, right? As the 96% had noted, you know, especially the first time help is offered, and they, you know, you could be weighing pros and cons. You could feel ashamed. You could not fully see that substance use is a problem. And getting people into some type of treatment is often, you know, one of the first hurdles, and many individuals aren't ready for that right away, right? So we need multiple approaches, right? Motivational interviewing, coaching into care, peer support, other communities, social strategies, you know, modeling, you know, when we see others who help, you know, who seek help, and just meet people where they are. So, you know, and now I would say, you know, so far in this presentation, we've really looked at the challenges that veterans may carry into, through, and after their military service. So now I want to shift to sort of the strengths, supports, and even some examples of resources, although obviously not all, but some examples of it, things that make recovery more possible, right? And part of that is building recovery capital. that we're going to discuss. So recovery capital is essentially everything in a person's life that helps a person get better and stay better. Next slide.
Okay, so as Dr. Gorman said, there's lots of different ways in which we can support our veterans who are, returning from active duty, who are facing challenges in their communities as they try to reintegrate after, discharge. And Recovery Capital provides a nice framework for thinking about the ways in which we can do that above and beyond sort of what we consider more traditional treatment. Although, let's put it out there, we've only even had substance use disorder as a diagnosis for a very brief period of human history. So, we're moving as fast as we can to address these issues. But there's lots of different areas of recovery capital. We're going to go over just a few of them, the more mainstream ones. But basically, one of the first ones that when we think about what recovery looks like and what resources we need to really support in our clients and communities, personal and human capital often comes up almost first. And that's really thinking about building up the individual's internal resources and really helping them manage the psychological impacts of not just their substance use issues and potentially co-occurring mental health and physical health issues, but also the impacts of service and learning to, cope with skills that are more functional for their daily life. So we'll often sort of see an emphasis here on really building up autonomy, keeping people engaged in treatment, especially when we're thinking about stigma. This can come up quite a bit when we think about building up someone's personal recovery capital resources. So one of the first places we often go is thinking about that health and well-being aspect of personal recovery, really thinking about evidence-based therapeutic interventions. We think about residential treatment. We think about group-based interventions, all to sort of build this understanding of the coping skills and autonomy that's needed to stop using substances. And this can look different in a lot of different ways for a lot of different people. This can look like psychological interventions with, PhD level clinicians or LCSWs. This can look like, different types of residential treatment. This can look like AA or NA, or this can look like, spiritual and religious-based communities coming together to support their, people who have substance use issues. And that's quite common in our veteran communities, a lot of emphasis on spiritual strength and building that up as part of recovery. And at the end of the day, what we're hoping to get as well is that coping skills, right? So how can we come up with healthy alternatives for our veterans? Ideally transdiagnostic, if we think about, substance use disorders and mental health issues is often, underlying mechanisms that are maintaining both and can be addressed by similar coping skills. So thinking about how do we help our clients, our veteran communities to really work with those moments of urges and cravings in a way that doesn't lead them to immediately use. Key to preventing relapse, but also key to, expanding your quality of life and functioning generally. So that can actually look like lots of different ways. And, there's been some recent research showing, especially a review of things that are available to veterans that, there are digital resources that can help with this self-management piece, as well as, the more traditional ones. But there's not a lot of research on the actual impact of these things. So we have something like Vet Change can be very helpful. But again, we need more research. We need more integration of innovative technologies for what we would consider sort of just-in-time interventions with these populations, because we're not available 24/7. Nobody's available 24/7. But digital interventions can sometimes be, and we would far prefer them using an evidence-based mobile application or website as opposed to potentially using, let's put it out there, ChatGPT or something. So there's a lot of opportunities in that space, but in particular to help with this sort of self-management, that is where a lot of this use of, digital self-management interventions can be particularly helpful. And like Dr. Gorman said, our veterans come in, they have so many strengths. They're so service-oriented, they're brilliant, they have great skill sets, and we can leverage them as clinicians, as communities of care, to help them re-engage with that self-efficacy and purpose that we know that they have internally. They just need to rebuild it or build it up in a different way. So really fostering self-confidence, sense of purpose, sense of community in our veterans, not just from the military to civilian life transition, but for our veterans who have been living a civilian life for decades, they can still feel really isolated, or like they've lost that purpose that they had. And there's a lot of research showing that, values-oriented living and meaningful, work and life can be extremely important. So which also goes into another large way that, at least in our work, we try to build up our veteran communities, which is, really engaging them in things like education and vocational rehabilitation services. There's a good amount of research showing that engagement in academic institutions, that engagement in meaningful work can help foster the stability and sense of purpose that then will lead to better outcomes for recovery. So really, we have so many different things in VA and beyond VA that can help our veteran communities really get that resource built up. And that can include things like using the GI Bill for educational benefits. It can include things like vocational rehabilitation. But at the end of the day, it's all in the purpose of really understanding that the person who will be consistently at the center of someone's recovery is going to be that individual, and really making sure that they feel like they're ready to take that on, because it's a big ask, and it's very difficult, but we know they can do it. We just, we need to provide better resources so that they recognize that they can do it too, and in doing it from the best place possible. Next slide. Another really major area of recovery capital, and I don't think anyone on this call would argue with that, is social capital. So we know that it is crucial for veterans who are, they're isolated a lot of the time when they're, managing their own substance use disorders, but just in general, we need to help them obtain and enhance positive social networks and positive quality of relationships, right? We know that this, research has shown for a while, this builds prevention from relapse. This builds their mental health functioning. This can help them bridge that military to civilian gap. So lots of different positive outcomes from building up social capital. Particularly important for a substance use disorder treatment and recovery, though. So you can help build, accountability and positive, feedback for the journey from using to hopefully not using substances as their coping mechanism or recreationally. External motivation can be helpful. Once you've built up the personal, let's build up the external group, right? Create that nice environment for recovery. Often this will include creation of new social networks. One of those areas that we see a lot of the time in terms of really predicting relapse is return to social groups that are not responsive to recovery goals, that are potentially also using. And this is happening for very human reasons. Isolation feels terrible. Losing your social network because you're trying to, stop hanging out with, let's say, friends and family who are using, that can be very difficult. So building up positive social networks is so important. Peer-to-peer support. So we have a lot of our veterans who like to, for instance, engage with one another and help each other through, their recovery journeys. We have a great peer specialist group and peer services available in VA and outside of VA. And we know that veterans are more likely to engage in not only their own recovery, but to feel like they can trust other veterans to help them through their recovery when there is a shared experience there. And, there's also this shared understanding of what it means to recover as a veteran. And we know reducing isolation improves mental health. tons of research on this, and we, talk about how bad isolation is compared to smoking a pack a day, right? Pretty equivalent. So building up that social network also has the secondary impact of, really hitting some of those, what we consider like transdiagnostic indicators of success for recovery, like feeling, socially connected, feeling like you have, more people who care about you, that, reducing anhedonia and negative mood, all important things when we think about recovery. So if I had to belabor the point, I would say, cultivating these strong social networks and social relationships is just really important, not just to build healthy friendships, right, and healthy families and healthy romantic partnerships, but these are the essential resources that people are going to rebuild their lives from, right? We are human beings who live in community, and those one-on-one interactions, those feeling cared for and caring for others, very important in our veteran communities, important in all of our human relationships. So really essential for maintaining sobriety, reducing relapse risk, and just reinforcing healthy lifestyle patterns. Next slide.
So the other thing that part of recovery capital is we'll talk about physical and financial recovery capital. And, this is about having practical resources, right, that make recovery and just stability possible. Safe housing, transportation, and income, right? Access to healthcare and treatment. And, these resources matter because financial stress doesn't just create an inconvenience, it can worsen mental health, it can increase suicide risk. And that's one reason this is a huge part of recovery capital. And there's one example we put on here called FinVet. And this is an example. And sort of this recognition of how much it does affect mental health. It was created by the VA Office of Suicide Prevention in recognition that financial well-being is connected to better mental health and lower suicide risk. So it helps veterans find resources, improve financial literacy, and build a kind of stability that supports, recovery. So importantly, it's not only about money management. It's about prevention, protection, right? Creating the stability that makes recovery more sustainable. So having the right amount of resources, having enough, can sort of bolster us, and that's why this is a big part of recovery capital is sort of building and maintaining this ability to have enough. And to have that means that you have an opportunity. As part of it, you have the opportunity to recover. So we'll move to the next slide. So another one, we'll talk about this cultural and community. And I know Dr. Reilly talked a lot about peer support and modeling, and let's bring it out even more, right? When we talk about cultural and community, this means being surrounded by people, by places, and values that support recovery, not undermine it. And for many people, in the case of sort of substance misuse and recovery from that, support can come from supportive family, supportive friends, self-help groups like AA or NA, where individuals can find structure or accountability or sponsorship, and peers who understand what recovery looks like day to day. Participation in mutual help groups has really been linked to better substance use outcomes over time. We know that there's community support that can also come from veteran serving organizations, faith communities, right? Other sort of recovery friendly spaces that can reduce stigma, help people feel understood rather than judged. These environments, they matter, right? Because it's a lot easier to get better and sustain that when it fits with a person's identity, when they have their people, right? When it fits with their values and their sense of belonging. So for veterans, I'll say especially, right, connection with other veterans can be powerful, right? It can be part of that recovery capital buildup. And, shared military experience can also make it easier to build trust in some ways, open up, accept support, give support. And one example I'll put here is sort of community recovery capital is for veterans, is really veteran socials. And when we talk about reintegration, we don't just mean with specific population, we mean to an entire community. And so socials aren't just those for individuals with substance use challenges. They're for an entire community, right? Weekly 90-minute peer-led community-based social groups. And there are social groups that fit this that aren't VA connected, that are out there. But the idea is that veterans come together, they have coffee or an activity on a weekly or monthly basis. And, just give sort of one example of someone, finding their community. I'll share sort of a journey of Jess finding social connection. She, after 6 years of service, Jess, like many veterans, grappled with profound disconnection upon separation. Finding supportive friendships was elusive, right? It compounded by sort of an undiagnosed post-traumatic stress and managing her own alcohol use challenges. Traditional support avenues she found, such as AA or religious groups, they sort of failed to comprehend her unique experiences and sometimes left her feeling a little more alone, right? And she began, like a lot of like those in the military know how to do, working hard, right? Working grueling hours to sort of escape the grip of negative emotions, in a sense, really toughing it out. And she discovered Veteran Socials, a weekly peer-led community-based social group around where she lived. Actually, a peer specialist mentioned it to her when she was at primary care, and she sort of didn't pay any attention. But then the peer specialist said it again and said, "Hey, I'll meet you there. Why don't you show up?" And so she went. She found comfort in this sort of weekly meeting with other veterans that she could relate to, and she didn't say much at first. She kind of but she was pretty quiet, but people understood, right? They gave her that space. And the environment really allowed her to share at her own pace, fostering a supportive network that sort of gradually became her lifeline. And eventually, I mean, she took other attendees up on their invitations. She joined them for events, outside these socials like hikes. Just found friends, and she trusted that VA peer specialists who encouraged her eventually to seek mental health treatment, and then encouraged her to kind of stick with it when things got hard. Right? She trusted that peer, and through this experience, Jess actually decided to give back and become a peer specialist, and become really passionate and committed to preventing others from experiencing that disconnection she once endured. And she helped co-author actually the guidebook to help spread veteran socials across over 170 locations in 28 states. And I bring it back to saying, like, this is kind of why recovery capital matters so much, right? A supportive community didn't just help Jess feel less alone, right? It gave her a pathway to heal, to contribute, to eventually help others do the same. And so when we talk about sort of cultural and community recovery capital, we're talking about exactly this, right? We're talking about the people, the places, the relationships that make recovery more possible and more sustainable. So, I'll leave you sort of with, a sort of a message and sort of summarizing in general what we're discussing. But, it is that sort of understanding substance use among veterans requires us to look at both risk and resilience. Veterans may face elevated risk because of trauma or reintegration stress or chronic pain or isolation and the loss of that sort of military community and really other factors that we've talked about. But both those risks can be reduced, right? When we help build recovery capital around them. So recovery capital means helping people strengthen coping skills, reconnect with supportive relationships, access stable resources, find really meaningful roles in the community. And just a story, right, shows us that what it can look like in real life, what community connection how it can reduce loneliness or support healing or create opportunities for not just one person to recover, but to lead and help others as well. So as we think about treatment and prevention and sort of understanding trends and the resilience that really showing the resilience that veterans have, right, we also think about long-term well-being, right? Not just reduce substance use, but to help veterans build lives that feel connected, purposeful, and worth sustaining. So I'll leave you with that. We can move on to the references and keep going.
Thank you, Dr. Gorman, Dr. Reilly, for that amazing discussion. And just so everyone knows, you will have access to and those references that we just went through there as well. All right, now I'd love to hear from the group, either through the chat box or of course use that raise hand function as well. A couple questions to, as you're kind of thinking about it, and of course, any additional questions you might have, we welcome those. The data show that many veterans with substance use disorder do not believe they need treatment, as we saw through that presentation. What strategies have you found that are effective engaging veterans who may not yet be ready for care? Along with that, to years troubling or community-based approaches into engagement. Let's see, Cheryl mentioned relational interviewing is a great tool. Victor seconding that.
I would like to third motivational interviewing, although it looks like maybe I've been fifth or sixth thing it now. Motivational interviewing, motivational enhancement, it's an amazing tool. And we've been testing it out as something that we attempt to do with veterans at different stages of their discharge journey and their reintegration journey. We are training many people in doing MI and MET, from in primary care, because it is so helpful in terms of getting veterans to get on, not just veterans, but veterans in particular, to get on board with the potential for treatment, improving their lives. So absolutely agree. It's fantastic. And I'm glad that it's become so widespread.
Yeah, I mean, it's really one of the best tools we have. We have sort of peer modeling and being in these social places where we can have microcultures where people are comfortable with help seeking and sort of have these consciousness raising events when they see other people that seek help for similar problems. But, these sort of MI and motivational enhancement, which they're very similar, but I sometimes use them interchangeably. But it's really one of the best tools that we have.
I see Cheryl mentioned New Hampshire has some fantastic peer support resources. Developing recovery supports is one of the main goals for all of the clients within our program. We identify the supports in their community. We reach out or go with them to help ease that initial anxiety. Yeah.
No, that's an excellent and very well founded in the research tool to getting people into care, is to do that one-on-one connection as well, in terms of aiding with the broader reintegration into community spaces. And Jay, I think you've done some work on this too, but yeah, that sort of like one-to-one, like veteran buddy or peer specialist, really assisting in the broader integration.
I see Clifford with your hand up. Go ahead.
Hey, Philip, it's good to see you again.
Hey, you too.
So just during the course of the presentation, a theme that I learned from somebody, but it was illustrated here. It wasn't explicitly said, but a concept that really helped me was like going from alienation and kind of forced compliance over to connection and belonging, and like just that jump or that change and how it's a process. It's not something that happens overnight. And one of the things that I've seen in my work is um, not just with veterans and military connected individuals, but I think it's amplified here, is like they're all good problem solvers. And it's not like this is not a problem to be solved. Really, it's a person to be loved, right? And I know people like, that word, it's not a tough word, but it's the same thing going from alienation, isolation to belonging and connection. And it's a process. And I really like that because I've noticed in my work, and it was mentioned in the story that was illustrated so beautifully was, when people finally ask for help, they're at their wits' end, right? And so like, what are things that we can do to like lower that barrier? And really appreciate the example that, like, they asked one time, they kind of said no, but they kept asking and kept asking and kept asking. And it may come off as like you may come off as like annoying or weird or awkward, but at the very and that may be true, but they know that you care, and eventually it lowers that barrier. And to me, that's how you make that jump from from somebody who feels alienated for whatever reason because of the disconnection process, or their previous trauma or trauma from the military, all the way over to finding belonging and connection within their new community.
I think that was really, I mean, that was really powerful and well said. And I also think, who that message comes from matters so much, right? It was coming from a peer. It wasn't your physician saying stop smoking, right? It was someone who was also in the military saying like you should check this out. And it makes such a difference, and it's taken so differently. It's understood in a different way, and I really sort of can appreciate the sort of journey you depicted.
And on that peer support piece, I see Keandra also had mentioned peer supports have been beneficial at our agency because we're across 18 counties in Mississippi. Yeah, absolutely. Spread thin so that that additional support makes a huge difference. William wrote social activities like coffee socials or wellness walks that allow them to stay engaged with peers without it being focused just on treatment, just providing that space for when they are ready. Well put, William. Anything to bring that initial barrier down. Andra mentioned dinners hosted by veteran service organizations. Yeah, absolutely. Create that sense of community. Any other questions, comments, pieces to add? I want to thank both of our presenters again for helping us through this discussion, for providing this amazing material, and taking the time to be able to engage with our audience from across the country and the territories and tribal affiliations. So thank you. Any final comments, Dr. Gorman or Dr. Reilly?
No, thank you for having us, and I really want to thank everyone here for for the great work that they do for the veteran community. The fact that you're here, I mean, really shows your dedication to veterans and their families and service members. I'm in deep appreciation of really everyone here, and so thanks for the opportunity for us to discuss.
Of course.
Yes, thank you for having us. And yeah, this was a great conversation too. It's always wonderful to hear what's going on external to our little bubbles. So thank you all for all the work you do. And yeah, hopefully it was helpful to us. Hopefully it was helpful to you all as well.
Absolutely. Thank you both again. All right, we give a few final slides just in wrap up and kind of prepping for the next meeting. This is always a component of our learning communities, optional, of course, but a little bit of veteran substance use disorder journey mapping. And the prompt here is map the typical journey of a veteran in your own community. So from first need to engagement to treatment to recovery, kind of that continuum there. And for each of those stages, consider what does this typically look like within your community? Where are those veterans most likely to disengage? So where are those kind of breakages and the links across your continuum? And what barriers or gaps exist at each point? And I think kind of some of those initial thoughts kind of help you get to those, from gaps to move towards some goals and potentially partnering with folks to help, bridge some of those gaps. So there's a little bit of optional homework, and we can go to the next slide. This is just a plug here for our RAND webinar series on advancing data policy and prevention for service members, veterans, and their families. There's a QR code here. Again, these slides will be distributed, but you can feel free now to take the time to capture that if you'd like. I believe that will lead you to the registration page here. This is part of a 6-part webinar series that's been bringing together our RAND researchers to examine critical issues affecting our SMVF across the military to civilian transition, right? That critical time period post-discharge and right before. The series explores how data, research, and policy insights can inform more effective programs, services, and prevention strategies at that national, state, and those community levels. Across the series, each individual webinar is focusing on topics relating to those transitioning service members, suicide prevention, or both of those, depending on the research focus for each session. And they'll highlight variations in veteran needs across those populations and geographies, examining the data and how it's collected, how it's used to inform policy, and translating those research findings into some practical insights for policymakers, practitioners, and community partners. So if that interests you, please do go ahead and take the time to register for that. And again, you'll have a copy of this. So when I do move on to the next slide, don't worry, you will get an opportunity to register. Okay. And then also here, our topics in the news. This is just a way to be able to stay up to date on all of our kind of technical assistance opportunities we have. Our webinars, our learning communities, communities of practice, any of our upcoming events and resources that we have. Please do go ahead and register if you'd like to, be a part of that. We release a monthly roundup that kind of gets you caught up on everything. If you'd like to be a part of that, like to be in the know there, you can take the time. You can also go to the SAMHSA SMVF TA Center sub page as well. To register and get on that email listserv. Next slide. Okay, and that brings us to just queuing up our next session. Our next session will be on Thursday, April 30th, same time, same place. And it will be on empowering veteran and military recovery through SAFE projects, peer and community programs. So definitely attend that one. And next slide. All right, and I want to thank everyone, our presenters again, for taking the time and providing these amazing resources and presentation here today, contributing your knowledge to the group and helping us through our discussion as well. If you do want to get in touch with the TA, you can either do so through a liaison or through our SMVF TA Center at prainc.com. And we will get to you on whatever you may need. And we look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.